I'd like to introduce Carl Soulsbury, Dr. Carl Soulsbury, who's going to give us a talk about the red fox tonight. Carl's a behavioural and evolutionary ecologist, senior lecturer and programme leader for ecology and conservation at the University of Lincoln. And he has a very broad research remit from at the university, with a history of research at Bristol and also in Finland. So we're really pleased to welcome you tonight, Carl. Thank you very much for doing the talk for us. We will take some questions. So to those of you that are familiar or not familiar with Zoom, we have a Q&A at the bottom where you can post your questions to us, and we'll gather them all together at the end and ask Carl, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. And thanks, Carl. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me nice and clearly. I'd like to start by 3 apologies. First apology is this is the first one of these talks I've actually done from home. So please bear with me if behind you my children suddenly burst in unannounced, the door isn't locked, or if the dog starts barking manically, because we sometimes get deliveries even at this time of night. It's all part, I guess, of home life and this kind of thing. My second apology is for the mess behind me. I don't have a lovely tidy office. I can't show you a nice background, so please bear with me. That is my children's stuff. And my final apology is really to the topic I'm going to do today. Normally when I give a talk on red foxes, it lasts anything up to an hour and a half, sometimes even 2 hours, depending on the questions at the end. And when I was asked to give this talk, I had to cut it down. And it was an incredibly painful task to do so. Every slide that I had to go through, I chopped it with a little bit of pain. So I feel that I'm only giving you the lightest infill in terms of the world of the red fox, and there's so much more that I could have talked to you about. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see my presentation. 2 seconds. Okay. Now, unfortunately, I can't see any questions or things coming down, but if somebody would like to say that they can see the screen, that would be very, very helpful. So my name is Dr. Carl Soulsbury. I have been studying foxes for nearly 20 years. I often look back at this time and think, where did it all go? During that time, I have absolutely remained passionate about this as a species. And I hope I get across to you today that red foxes are truly amazing. We perhaps take them for granted, but actually they're one of the most amazingly adaptable species out there, with a distribution and an ecology which is really unrivaled amongst other animals. So I'm going to start by telling you what is a fox and also what's not a fox. So the name fox, the word fox, was exported from Europe and actually applied to a bunch of other small dog-like canids around the world, many of which may look superficially fox-like, but actually bear no resemblance whatsoever. They actually have no affinity. So in this figure, I've got some pictures of foxes from South America and North America, and they're actually much more closely related to wolves. And they're an offshoot of wolves, not related in any way to the foxes that we would recognize. Real foxes, the true foxes, include the animals in the middle, which is the bat-eared fox at the top and the raccoon dog at the bottom. The smallest fox in the world, which is the cute little fennec fox, the one that's closing its eyes against the sand. And the largest of the true foxes, which is the red fox, the fox which is found in Britain. And as I'm going to show you, is the most widespread, not only of the foxes around the world, the most widespread of all canids around the world, and indeed the most widespread of all terrestrial mammals outside those that are carried around by humans. They are an amazingly adaptable, wonderful species. Just before we came on, your colleague said that this was the last talk before Christmas, and I actually hadn't realised that. So I apologise for the lack of foxes in snow to give it that kind of Christmassy theme. There are a few pictures of foxes in snow, but not as many as I could have made. So where are foxes found? So they have a native distribution across the entirety of the northern hemisphere, being widespread across Eurasia and down into the edge of Africa. They're a bit more range limited in Africa, being found generally around the coastal regions, not really penetrating the deserts, but also being found across the Nile and the Nile River. They have a native range across much of North America, extending away from this is the foxes are found in an amazing range of habitats. They are found in dry, desert conditions. They're found in tropical forests down in Southeast Asia, even amazingly, all the way up to the extreme cold climates, the northern fringes of the tundra in Canada and Russia, for example. This distribution is a testament to the fox's ability to adapt to extreme conditions, to differing climates and foods that might be available. They adapt, as I say, amazingly well. As you can imagine, they live in very different habits and have very different behaviours in these habitats. So up in the northern Arctic tundra, where there's very little food, you'll generally get a breeding pair of individuals and potentially roaming across massively huge areas, hundreds of square kilometres. There's so little food there that the pairs have to range over a massive area to get enough food to survive. Similarly, in the desert regions, they have to have very, very large territories. On these desert regions, for example, as I'm going to show you later, well, they're mainly feeding or feeding on things such as insects rather than, say, mammals or birds or things. They'll eat essentially anything. I don't like the term buckets on legs, but really they are. Part of their success is their adaptability to try and exploit different food sources. In desert regions, they actually live generally more often in larger family groups. So not just pairs, often in larger family groups. But again, they need to live in wide-ranging areas. The last habitat I'm going to show you to kind of emphasize their brilliance is perhaps one of the most extreme habitats out there. There are very, very few animals around the world that are as successful as red foxes exploiting the urban environment. And in fact, they exploit it in such a way that they live here at much higher densities than anywhere else in any other habitat. So in an urban territory, they can have home ranges of less than half a square kilometre, which is tiny. The smallest territories can really be a handful of gardens. Those handful of gardens have enough food to support not one fox or even one pair of foxes, but often several foxes living within this. When I was working on foxes in Bristol, we had one of my colleagues was looking at these fox territories and trying to work out how much food was available to them. And we estimated that we're about 60 times the amount of food available in an urban fox territory than they needed to survive. So huge amounts of food available in this habitat. So they're exceedingly successful in really quite extreme environments. Now, that success that they have really comes in terms of not just their behavior, but also their body shape, their size. And so they vary in their coat. Unsurprisingly, foxes found in the extreme northern regions have thick coats to insulate from cold. These are foxes from Japan on the left. This is actually a tame fox farm where people go and feed foxes. They like interacting with them. In desert regions, you can see they're much slimmer and thinner with a short coat and also much larger ears. And again, that helps changing their heat loss. So they change massively in terms of their coat. They range massively in size. Now, I realise these numbers perhaps don't mean very much to you, but suffice to say there's nearly a threefold difference in their body sizes between their smallest range, which is found in the desert region, arid regions, in Arabia and Africa, for example, through really to the largest foxes, which are found in the boreal regions of Scandinavia, where they average around about 8 kilos. So these are the average sizes for these individuals. These are not, and individuals will be much, much smaller. I was looking at some analysis, actually collecting some data on different body sizes of foxes. And in some places, the smallest adult foxes in desert regions, not the average, but smallest, were just over a bag and a half of sugar. So really, 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 really tiny. You compare that to the largest foxes, the real extreme ones might be even 12 kilos inside. That's not the average, but the big males might be 12 kilos. Now, something I want to highlight really is a context to the size. So quite often when I was working on foxes, people would come up to me and tell me they'd seen a fox the size of an Alsatian or something. Foxes are small. They're relatively long-limbed, but they're actually relatively light-bodied by comparison. And An average male fox in Bristol, my study population, was about 6.5 kilos, an average. The largest male I ever caught was just under 10 kilos, and the largest female I ever caught was 9 kilos. Females tend to be a little bit smaller, about 5 to 5.5 kilos, but that's really tiny. It really is small. If you compare that to a sort of average medium-sized dog, like a collie, they weigh about 18 to 25 kilos. My dog, which will undoubtedly start barking at some point during this session, she weighs about 20 kilos, and she's quite tiny. So foxes are much, much smaller than we really believe. If you compare that to an average sized cat, they weigh anything between 2 and 5 kilos. There's great overlap in the size of a domestic house cat and a fox. So we shouldn't forget, we don't think foxes are much bigger than they actually are. Partially, one reason why they're so successful in our urban areas is because they're actually quite small. They're quite small animals. They don't need as much food as they would if they're much larger, but at the same time, that small size allows them to be flexible in their habits, to squeeze through areas, to find places and spaces to breed in an urban area. If we compare that with other urban animals around the world, for example, coyotes in North America, another urban canid species, they average about twice to sometimes 2.5 times the size of foxes. So they average somewhere between 12 to about 18 kilos, but still much smaller than a dog for comparison. But foxes are pretty tiny. They also vary substantially in their coloration. So across here in Europe and in Britain in particular, we really only have one generally quite common morph, and that's that orangey russet colour with black forepaws and the white on the face. That's the dominant coloration for the European kind of subtype. In North America, they have 2 other colours which are relatively more frequent. They have one that's known as a silver fox, and this is the one seen in the top left-hand corner. It's a fox which is black with these lovely, beautiful silver tips. It's been widely brought into fur farming and is used for fur farming purposes, but it's a wild morph, and that tends to appear relatively rarely here in Europe. In fact, if you find or if you get observations of silver foxes, the likelihood is that they've probably got some kind of heritage from a fur farm in the past. It's probably American genetics that have persisted, been brought in. The other colour morph that can be found is known as a cross fox. And this is where the adults have a black ridge of guard fur down their spine, and it goes across the shoulder blade. So if you're looking down on the fox from above, it looks like it's got a cross. But the rest of the pelage is kind of more orangey brown with a bit more dark in it than the orange morph. The foxes themselves have often been selected for different coloration from a human-induced process. So the other 2 pictures here, you can see a white fox and you can see a kind of lovely cinnamon fox. And later on, I got a picture of beautiful piebald foxes, which look a bit like border collie pups. They're all through artificial selection. So they've got an inherent plasticity, not only in their behavior, but also their ability to change their size and their shape and their color to the ambient conditions and the environment. So I want to move on a little bit. So normally I would actually talk a little bit about European and North American foxes, but I want to talk to you a little bit now about the foxes and the fox's life. Excuse me. So this is a basic fox year, and we're actually approaching the most exciting period, at least the most exciting period I think in the calendar, which is the mating period. Foxes give birth around about the end of March, April. When we were studying them, we used to give all of the fox cubs a birth date of 1st of April, just for convenience. They're followed by a period of dependency, where the offspring are firstly fed milk, then fed food items, larger food items. There is a period in the autumn when these youngsters disperse away. And there's a period starting mid-December, but really the peak of which is actually in January and February of the mating period. And I'm going to go into more detail. Don't worry about this. I'm going to give you more detail of these periods. So I'm going to start actually with the mating period, because this is what we're coming up to now. And it's characterized by a lot more vocalizations, and the scream that you hear at night is the female signaling to the male. And actually, indeed, what you may notice sometimes is an increased frequency of this around about the mid to late January, to the first week of February. The males do call as well, but it's a lot softer. I always imagine, can do an impression of it, but it's not very good. It sounds a little bit like a bicycle brake, so someone's trying to stop themselves going down a steep hill. It's a triple bark, a little kind of woo, 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 much softer. And it's actually for much more localized signaling. So that vocalization the female does is much more for long distance signaling to attract males, potentially her own mates, but as we're going to see, potentially also the neighbor's mate. So mating is taking place about January. Vixens give birth in April, and the cubs remain with the female underground for about a month. Born relatively small, and they need the mother to thermoregulate, and she does occasionally leave them, although that's progressive as they get larger. She spends most of the time in that initial period with the cubs. The male plays a critical role at this point. They live, as we're going to see later on, as a pair. During that period, when she is with the cubs, the male will bring food to her, and there's quite a strong reliance of the vixen on food items that the male brings around. Now you can see this picture of mating foxes here. They've got something known as a copulatory lock, like many canid species. So the male is locked inside the female and will stay there for a period of time while fertilization is taking place. And the female generally is the one here that has the primary control. And I've had the misfortune of disturbing mating foxes in gardens. It's been the female that's dragged the male over the fence by his genitals, and unfortunately I felt very sorry for the male at that point. He seemed a bit passive, but she's the one that does all the moving. Now this period of mating is quite a vigorous period of activity. Males will fight for access to females, so although they will live as one male and one female, the males will still fight and compete for access. A lot of this is relatively low-level sparring, so up on their hind legs, pushing each other, mouth gaping, but serious injuries can take place. So they can get muzzle injuries, they can get bites on their limbs, which get septic, they can even kill each other. I have a fox skull actually sitting on a shelf above me here of a very, very large male. And on the top of that male skull is a ridge of bone where his muscles will attach. And there is a nick of bone that goes straight through it. For many years, I never thought much about it, but I was actually doing a talk. I had 2 fox skulls, another fox skull I brought with me at the same time. And I actually lined up the canine teeth of this other skull, and it went straight through this bone of this male. So at some point in this large male's life, he would have had another fox scraping their canines straight across and breaking some of the bone on their skulls. So these are serious flights. One consequence of this battling is that the larger males are more likely to succeed in gaining access to the females. So as I said, although the one male and one female live together, males will compete for access, and potentially, as we're going to see later on, some of the neighboring males may potentially cuckold the neighboring males. To try and avoid this, to try and maintain the access to females, they do partake in mate guarding. So the male will guard the female extensively during that time period. So there's a little bit of conflict going on here where the female is actually trying to perhaps attract males from further away to come and mate with her. And that's where that long distance call comes in. The other thing that's happening at this time of year is there a very strong smell in their urine. So a number of key chemical signals are being produced. And again, for many of you who've gone out walking in the countryside, you probably noticed that sharp smell of a fox, and that's an upsurge in these chemicals during the breeding period. I have to admit, having worked on foxes for ages, I actually really like that smell. I know a lot of people don't, but I actually really like the smell of fox urine. It's very evocative to me. So after cubs are born, they're fed milk, and they're weaned after about 4 to 6 weeks, but they will rely on their parents for food up until about the end of June. So they gradually start to have more solid food in their diets, and by June's come, they're taking only solid food, which their parents are bringing back to their den. If there are more than just parents, so actually some helpers will also bring food items to the cubs to feed on. Now, up until 12 weeks, they're completely reliant, and one of the key foods that they rely on are both mammals and birds, essentially large packets of food. The foxes will eat lots of different things, but it's not very economical for them to bring mouthfuls of worms or mouthfuls of insects to the den. It just doesn't make sense energetically. So they prioritize bringing these large food items to the den and giving them to their cubs. And this is one key thing as well, because it helps reduce their overall workload, especially if they've got helpers. So those helpers don't necessarily increase the number of cubs being produced, but the adults themselves are in better condition at the end of the breeding season. So anyone with children will know how tiring it is to raise offspring. By the time the cubs are independent of their parents, the adults usually look pretty ragged, look pretty tired. So there's a new key step in a fox cub's life, and that's when it becomes nutritionally independent. And what this means is that they have to go out and forage for food in themselves. They can't just simply go to the fridge. They have to go out and basically learn the skills for capturing food. And this actually causes a change in the cub diet. If we look at this, is some work I did during my PhD. I looked at this change of diet, and you can see what's happening in terms of the large food items is they stop at the age of 3-4 months. So about July time, the amount of avian prey drops dramatically in the diet, and that's because the parents are not bringing them anymore. Catching birds and catching mammals to a certain extent takes skill and practice. What goes shooting up are things that are easy to find, so insects and earthworms, small morsels of food that don't really require any great skill. Now this period in July is really key for the cubs. Twofold. Firstly, they lose condition, they tend to lose elements of body fat, and the amount of fat and actually their whole growth is dependent on the amount of availability of these earthworms and insects, and particularly for earthworms. I would always say that when there's a poor Wimbledon with lots of rain, it's actually a really good summer for fox cubs, because there's increased availability of things like earthworms. And such as its impact, their overall body size, when they reach full grown size a few months later, is entirely dependent on the amount of rainfall they get during that July period. Even in an urban area where there are lots of other food sources, their adult size, their full grown size is dependent on that weather during that one month period. To illustrate this, I had some really stark data that was collected in the mid-90s, and it was 2 years and side by side. 1 year, it's very wet. Fox cubs grew really smoothly, grew to quite a large size. The following year, there was a drought, specifically over that summer period. And you could see the fox cubs' weight, they just stopped growing. It just leveled out for a month, and then caught up again in the August period and started to catch up. And although they grew, they never got to the same size as the cubs from the previous year. They never got to the same full-grown size. There was a complete step in their whole growth rates because of that drought. And now, of course, when we think about more widely things like climate change, we shouldn't forget that even subtle changes in the amount of rain or the amount of warm weather we have will have impacts on all of our common animals across the country. So even foxes, who are super successful, at least here in the UK, are going to be impacted by this. After this growth period, the next key stage for foxes is in the autumn period, starting about late September through October, November, December. And this is when the juvenile cubs, juvenile foxes, the young of the year, choose to either leave the territory and try and establish a new location to reproduce, or they remain and potentially help raise the next generation of cubs, so known as dispersers and philopatric individuals. It coincides with a peak in mortality. So a lot of these individuals are exploring new areas, and unfortunately they get killed or potentially run over. They also tend to get up into all kinds of mischief. So this is the period when they magically turn up in shops or wandering around in bizarre places. They can move really, really long distances. So in terms of straight line distances, a few hundred kilometers, but actually in terms of kind of more tortuous paths, it can be thousands. In boreal regions of Scandinavia, they can move thousands of kilometers. Back in the 60s, they did some homing experiments where they took cubs away from their site they were born and looked at how far it took them if they could get back home. And they could home relatively well, even from about 50 to 60 kilometers away. It was the homing instinct. This movement, this ability to move long distances, means that they can recolonize areas really rapidly. So any kind of long-term fox control, anything like that, is only really temporary. This is a problem they faced in Australia, where foxes can relatively quickly recolonize areas if they've been trapped or shot out, for example. So the next period for them is back towards the breeding period. So by January time, January time, those territories are being reformed again. And most of the subadults have either stopped moving or have died, or some will continue searching for a long time. My actual work during my PhD and my doctorate was actually on these individuals and looking at the combination of behavioural strategies they took while they were looking for places to stay. So that's a fox year, but moving on to some other key things. And firstly, fox diet. And all I'd really say about fox diet is if it's edible, they'll eat it. And even if it's not edible, they'll probably try eating it. Of all the fox stomachs I've looked at, I wouldn't say there was ever a consistent one. These animals will eat anything. Obviously, it changes seasonally. In autumn period, where there's lots and lots of fruit available, they'll eat lots and lots of fruit, upsurge of blackberries, windfall and apples. They'll eat mice if there are lots of mice around. They'll eat carrion. They will eat scavenged material. They will eat rubbish, and they will eat leftover remnants people put out for them. Essentially, they will try everything. That does cause them trouble. I have many a tale of what that leads to, but they will basically try absolutely everything. So this is actually examples of stuff actually from fox stomachs just in Bristol. So it includes things you might expect, small rodents, but fruits, insects, birds, carrion, reptiles, large numbers of earthworms, stuff people throw on compost heaps. They will eat vegetable matter. I've seen bits of cauliflower and broccoli and remnants like that. They will eat chicken bones. They will, of course, eat pets. They will eat chickens if people keep them outside and they can get access to them. Fox diet, the key to their success is they'll have a go, essentially. They can try anything and they will adapt. Where there is enough food to support them, they can probably be ultimately very successful. They will try, and that's one reason why they get into all manner of difficulties is because of that brazenness. There's a reason why many of our tales are about the sly fox. They are clever animals. There's no ways about it. They will try their best to access food, to explore new habitats. And as I say, yes, they get themselves into all manner of difficulty, and ultimately persistence pays off. So they're not afraid to potentially tackle animals larger themselves. This is taken from the Alps, where there was clearly a carrion available for this fox, and this fox was driving off a vulture many times its size. Now, the reason I thought I'd focus a little bit on the fox diet, firstly, it's because where I've worked, but also because it's one of the kind of common misconceptions. So you will see many quotes about foxes rifling through bins and subsisting on leftovers and takeaways. And indeed, there was a long-standing urban myth that urban foxes in particular, were starving when there was an introduction of wheelie bins. Just not true. The only foxes I've seen that have ever had any problems with food tend to be those that were infected with sarcoptic mange. Actually, it wasn't because they couldn't get food. Their stomachs, when I used to do necropsies, their stomachs were always packed food. That was an impact of the disease itself and the ability for them to get nutrition into their body. But they weren't struggling to find food. They were always absolutely rammed full of food. Foxes don't need to rifle our bins. Like anything, they'll take an opportunity, but ultimately, they will eat pretty much everything. If we look at actually some detailed numbers from a number of cities and also looking at survey data, the majority of people didn't have their rubbish actually rifled. And indeed, where you've got wheelie bins, that's decreased even further. And that's people having rubbish rifled. That doesn't say who actually is. And that includes potentially rats and free-ranging cats will also rip open bags and eat it and eat items. In Bristol, for example, the majority of the fox's diet actually came from deliberately provided scavenged food. So this was scavenged meat people were putting out for the foxes, as well as other items. People would scatter bread onto the lawn, birdseed. Birds like birdseed. Their foxes like birdseed. They would eat it. They would eat scattered bread, for example, as well as more natural foods, wild mammals, birds, invertebrates, and fruit, and a small proportion of pets. They didn't need to go rifle through the rubbish because there was so much other food available to them. In London, there was a slightly different picture, but even then, over 35% of their diet was still coming from deliberately provided food. So it varies from location to location, a little bit of the history of feeding animals and feeding foxes in particular. but foxes were still able to find plenty of wild food available to them. So this idea, this urban foxes are reliant on scavenged food that could get from bins is just not true. I guess the other issue is staged photos. Now I remember the very first one of these was done many years ago by Chris Packham. I remember seeing him actually showing how he did it. And what he did is he cut a hole in a bin, scattered some rubbish out front and waited at the back of the bin to look for the fox. And of course the fox comes along and says, "What are you doing in the bin?" And you've got your lovely photograph. I appreciate that the action of looking down at the bin that I've just done for the camera works better in person, but you can imagine what a fox would be saying. These are the classic photos that appear in newspapers when there's some anti-fox story. I'm not going to say foxes don't do it, but foxes, they don't push over wheelie bins. They're not huge bin rakers. They'll take an opportunity if there's rubbish poorly stored, but photos like this don't do their overall aura any help, unfortunately. So just to highlight that the majority of their food is mainly scrap food, and they are opportunistic and they'll feed absolutely anything. This is actually a picture of one of our study foxes that somebody took. She used to help us with our work. And this is a fox that come down every day during the daytime to be fed in a dog bowl because she liked seeing them. And they're regular as well. They actually, I would say, almost train us to feed them at the correct time. I remember getting a phone call from a lady. She said, "One of your foxes comes into our garden with a collar on it, a brown collar." This was a fox that actually was way before my time. So it was quite an old fox. We didn't know who it was. She said, "It comes at 4 o'clock every day." Ha, 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 we said. Of course it doesn't come. We went there, 4 o'clock on the dot, in it comes, regular as pie. It came to be fed. So these animals learn very quickly where the food items and food sources are. So moving on to the kind of the latter part of the talk, just a bit about fox social life. So we've already kind of hinted that they've got complex social lives. Most fox groups will be based around a dominant male and dominant female. And for a long time, they were thought to be the sole individuals that would breed in a group. And in some areas, particularly urban areas, there can be a varying number of subordinate individuals that may also be in that fox group. In most locations, it will be subordinate females. But where there are particularly high densities, there may also be subordinate males. Now, in the majority of cases, the subordinate males and females are usually directly related to the dominant male and females. They're usually offspring from the previous year. But in high densities, you can get unrelated individuals joining the social group. Now, I'm using the word group here. I'm using it quite deliberately because these are social groups and they're not packs. And the key definition really is that the animals come together, they're social, groom each other, they'll help raise offspring, they'll babysit cubs and things, but they forage in a solitary manner. If you see 2 or 3 foxes together on a lawn, they're not there in any kind of cooperative hunting that you might expect from packs or packs of wolves or prides of lions. These are solitary foragers. So these subordinate females are usually offspring from previous years. So you get these little matrilineal lineages within these groups. And even if the females, and a lower proportion of them do, actually leave their territories and move out to look for a new territory, they often move only short distances. So quite often you get clusters of related females. And so you may have the daughter as a neighbouring female or 2 or 3 daughters surrounding the previous dominant female's territory. And that actually probably has a function of reducing the amount of aggression, at least amongst the females, because they are territorial. So I'm going to show you some real data. So this is based on radio tracking data. And I have to admit, I look back on this incredibly fondly, maybe slightly wistfully, because all this data was collected between 8 p.m. at night and 4 a.m. in the morning, collecting data, walking many kilometers through the city with a radio transmitter, listening to a bleep on a tracker. The yellow in this figure are radio tracking data from females, and the blue data are from males. And you'll see that there are some gaps, and sometimes that's because we knew a fox was there, but we didn't have a collar on it. And in some cases, if there's a complete gap, we just didn't have the animal. There were no free spaces to emphasize. These territories fitted together tightly, and any gaps are just simply because we didn't have the data available. What you can see is that there's a high degree of overlap between the male and female territories. So if you look towards the bottom left, there's a number 3286, who was a female called Kester, and I have to admit I gave most of them names. And 3269 called Chaos, they were the dominant male and female. And you can see how perfectly the blue and yellow lines overlap. They are a social group with perfect concordance of their territories. Where you sometimes see overlapping with neighbours, those overlap zones typically have very, very little contact. So they may overlap, but maybe only 10% of their time is ever spent in these contact zones. So they only spend a little bit of time there because they will act aggressively to their neighbours and intruders. And ultimately that leads to these boundaries forming, often actually sometimes down key linear features. You'll see where you've got multiple individuals. So if you look towards the right, there's 3315, which is a juvenile male, 3193, which is a female that appeared on TV a number of times, and a male 3318. And that was a social group. And you can see again, all the individuals in that social group have got a very, very similar territory shape. So these are individual family units. And what happens, at least when I was studying them, is when a group perhaps died out, perhaps a dominant male died out, female died out, rather than an individual moving in, because we had relatively low dispersal in that time, the neighbours would just fill the space, they'd take it over. And so sometimes they'd have a 50% expansion of a territory almost overnight. And it's to emphasise though, it's just very rapid. I remember some individuals dying, and I caught the new individual in that territory days later. So individuals are rapidly moving in. So these are all territorial individuals, but there were individuals moving around here, potentially looking for any vacancy if it opened up. And it was exceedingly rapid. So these territory sizes can vary massively. So at the largest in Arctic areas and tundra areas and some desert regions, it can be hundreds of square kilometers, down to being less than half a kilometer square in those urban areas. And those groups vary from pairs to 6 to 7 individuals. Sorry, hold on a second. I don't know, I'm in the middle of talk. Goodbye. I had to emphasize, apologies for my son appearing magically behind them. They're groups, not packs. And as I say, that is because they are social, they're socially bonded, they can have dominance and subordinate behaviors, they have affiliative behaviors, they show behaviors such as babysitting, alloparenting, they can bring in food, they can even show allosuckling, but they are solitary individuals. And I used to follow foxes all through the night, and I actually rarely saw them interacting with other individuals. They did it in gardens, clearly, but very rarely did I ever see that. Rarely saw them fighting. I very rarely saw them chasing each other, but actually rarely, they spent most of their times on their own. I spent a lot of time with those foxes. I do love them, miss them. So the fox mating system is built around a dominant male and dominant female. For a long time, we thought only the dominant male and dominant female would reproduce. But actually, when we started looking at genetic data, we found that a large proportion of the subordinate females were also reproducing. And actually, you had quite large groups, and sometimes 2 or 3 females might reproduce and pool the litters. So you could suddenly have an average litter is 4 or 5 cubs. You could have 15 cubs all living under one shed, for example. And the females were pooling the resources, sharing babysitting duties. Now the males, as I've alluded to, they would spend some of their time potentially moving across and out of their own territory during their breeding system. So you can see from these dots, which are aligned to the colours of the individuals, they move away during the breeding system. If we look at the blue circle and the blue lines, this individual, this was a male called Trinity, he would move across several territories, a huge male, and ultimately he was looking to sire potentially cubs in these other male territories, so usurping the dominant male and reproducing with the female. He wouldn't help raise those cubs, he would go back to his dominant female. And indeed, it was very, very normal for a male to actually raise the cubs of another male. He didn't seem to be able to identify that the cubs weren't actually his. And this happened a number of times. And I remember some of these tracking movements really clearly, especially this one that goes up towards the black circle, because I was actually in that black circle at the time when he appeared on the golf course. It was a beautiful night for tracking. In really high densities, you can actually have multiple males siring cubs within the same litter. And the record we found was actually 4 males siring different cubs within the same litter. So one litter of cubs had 4 different fathers in it. One mother, 4 different fathers, which is really quite shocking. But in general, what we found is that the amount of success that the males had was related to their size. So my last part of the talk is a little bit more focused on urban foxes and actually about how they interact a little bit with humans and actually what foxes mean to us. So firstly, we think of urban foxes being a British phenomenon, but actually they were first recorded, believe it or not, in Australia back in the 1930s. Since then, since the earliest records, the reports of urban foxes have been pretty much everywhere where foxes are found. And indeed, perhaps the major limitation is not the presence of foxes, but some other pressure in the environment, either a lack of suitable habitat, but quite often things such as stray dogs are of importance. And so many European countries which still have quite high stray dog populations, the stray dogs outcompete or certainly potentially kill foxes in urban areas. Which is possibly one of the reasons why they're not so common in some places, but they're really globally widespread. In Britain, at least, they colonized during the 30s, and they really coincide with this low density housing. So that post-war expansion of houses with large gardens was ideal for foxes. That lovely heterogeneous habitat, lots of structure and sheds and things like that was perfect for them. They colonized central London in the 1960s, and they're still spreading in many urban areas. So though they're absent from some northern towns, the likelihood is that they will colonize most British towns and cities at some point in the next few years. It's still a process that's ongoing. They've been established for a long time in some cities, but this is something that's now starting to happen in Eastern England in particular, but also in some northern places. Now, there's a complicated question I get asked a lot, is are urban foxes increasing? Really, it depends on where you are. Peter Crowden, I actually gave a talk many years ago to the NPTA with Peter Crowden. They often talk about urban foxes increasing, but it's a complicated answer. In areas where fox populations had a disease outbreak, populations are recovering. And so to notice the word here, they're recovering to previous levels, they're not increasing. Some places they're very stable, and in some places they're moving into urban areas where they weren't found before. So really that picture of what they are is really dependent on that area. Peter Brown, a very nice chap. When I gave that talk, he gave me the sharpest ever cooking knife as a gift to say thank you. And I took it home and probably chopped a bit of my finger off with it. It was so sharp. So really, if you want to ask that question, and I'm sure somebody might do in the questions later on, it's really a yes and no. It's a challenging question to answer because it really depends on the location you're actually found in it. It depends a little bit about the preceding population dynamics of the population. Now, I'm not going to say foxes are wonderful and perfect because they're not. They can cause problems, and they can occasionally and rarely attack people. And that's usually because people do silly things like this chap, such as hand feeding them, encourage them into their houses. Foxes are curious. They get into all manner of trouble and difficulties. And really, when we had really high densities in Bristol, there were a large number of people who were trying to hand feed their foxes. The foxes were much bolder than you might expect. Now, to put it in context in terms of fox attacks, the only paper I could find on actually quantitative data on the number of fox attacks was a quite old paper from Aberdeen. Whether this is represented the country or not, I don't know. In a 3-month period, the majority of people who were in accident and emergency were either bitten by dogs or bitten by humans, which is a bit disgusting. Your chances of being hospitalized by a fox bite were the same as actually being hospitalized by a horse bite, a rabbit bite, a squirrel bite, a pig bite, and a field mouse bite. I'd been bitten by foxes. I used to catch them, I would handle them, and very occasionally, I got that wrong, and they would bite me. Let me tell you, a fox bite hurts, and it hurts a lot. When they bite, it's not a warning bite, they're really biting because they mean it. And I still have the scars on my hands and wrists from where that happened. So I know how severe those bites are. But just this is one example. You're more likely to be hospitalized by being bitten by hamsters than you are by bitten foxes. It's a really, really rare occurrence. I'm not going to say it isn't going to happen, but it is really rare. More likely is that maybe predation on pets, particularly things such as chickens or outdoor rabbits if they're not securely housed. Potentially disease and also road traffic accidents. Although that tends to be much rarer than it used to be. I actually saw people deliberately trying to run foxes over during my nighttime By deliberately, I mean I've actually seen people mount pavements with their cars to try and hit foxes, which is really, as I say, shocking. Most people, and I really stress them, the majority of people like foxes. It's really difficult to quantify the cost of something such as the joy. I'd love to have foxes in my garden here in rural Lincolnshire. I'd love to have them here. The value people get from wildlife watching is really, really, really important. Just to pose it in context though, in the study site where I was working, there were on average 300 to sometimes even 500 cats per square kilometre, and there were only 5 to 15 foxes. There were innumerate number of cats. At any evening time, you could see lines of cats lining the road or lining the walls on the road. There were so many of them. About 10% of those cats each year would be run over by cars, which is no great surprise because cars are the major source of mortality. And only a handful of them, the cats that were very young or sometimes that were unwell, were being killed by foxes. And indeed, in all the times I've been out, I've only ever seen cats chasing foxes in gardens. And just to put it in context, when we talk about human-wildlife conflict, across in America, a quarter of all the coyotes, a quarter of all cats in a 4-week period were killed by coyotes in a very, very short space of time. And there's a real problem. 0.7% killed by foxes is not a problem. 25% killed in 4 weeks by coyotes is a real problem. And I can hear my dog barking, so I might have to move for 2 seconds if that continues. Most of the problems with loss of pets or livestock tends to be from inadequate housing. And really, it's the emphasis on us as owners to maintain protection of those. Inadequate housing, ultimately, the fox will take advantage of it. I know people who had free-ranging chickens and the fox didn't notice them for a year. And then one day it did notice them and killed a lot. But having free-ranging chickens where you know foxes are moving through your garden is really just asking for trouble. So my last few slides are about our relationship with them. Let's just say it's complicated. We've used them for a long time as food, for fur, for resources. We've hunted them as pets and sport, but we love them. They are used within our imagery, our iconography. They're used within literature extensively. Just if you want to know, that's a picture of the piebald foxes that I mentioned earlier on. Just how cute that, like border collie puppies. We've lent their name to God's. Sorry. I warned you this might happen. I'll be back in 2 seconds. Apologies, children can be quite annoying. So throughout human history, we've used foxes for their imagery, sometimes in a positive manner, sometimes in a sly manner, for example. In Japanese mythology, the kitsune is seen as a female shape-shifting fox that seduces males, for example. In Lappish, the term firefox, which we all recognize as a browser, actually is used to denote the aurora borealis. The northern lights that wave at night in northern Lapland is meant to be the firefox painting the sky with its tail, which I think is beautifully poetic. One of my favorite iconography. We tend to use it in modern imagery to mean something cunning or clever or rogue or adaptable, or also soft or sexy. So we use it to demonstrate that adaptability is actually part of our use of iconography. It also lends its name to other animals, either because it looks like it, in terms of coloration or the shape of plants, or believe it or not, in the case of this lovely fox snake I've got a picture of, because it smells like a fox. So it lends its name widely to other animals, not just ourselves. We've used it extensively. And my second last slide, because I appreciate I'm slightly running over, we like foxes. Any survey in the UK or in Europe, for example, we like foxes. We have really strong positive views. Rowan, go away. We like them. They still are loved and hated in equal measure. We have historical reasons, cultural reasons that dislike, but ultimately they're viewed positively. People are interested. It shows that how many of you have come today to listen to this talk. it's a wonderful thing, I think, and I really have only given you a brief insight to what foxes are and what they mean to us. And now, I just want to say thank you all for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed this really rapid, brief overview, and I'm happy to take any questions. I have to briefly go again. I'm going to stop my screen share, but that allows other people to come back onto screen, and then I'll start taking questions. I'm happy to answer them, even for a little bit of time. 2 seconds. Hello. Okay, hold with me while I open the chat.
Thanks ever so much for that, Carl. I think Becky's going to go through the questions and answers and ask the questions to yourself to answer. So there it is. You're on mute, Becky. Are you able to unmute yourself? No, okay. Bear with me.
Our classic problem.
Yeah. Okay. Try that. Unless you want to, can you see the questions?
I can, I'm happy to take them. So
okay,
a question from Helen B. Any tips for identifying males and females on camera traps? It can be challenging. With females in springtime, if they have cubs, you can usually see quite large distended teats. The females as well lose their belly fur, and it tends to go kind of a reddy orange, reddy pinky color when they've got cubs. Other times of the year it becomes really challenging. So the idea that they've got a white tag on the tail differentiates between a male and a female is not true. I've seen plenty of females with massive white tags. Really, unless you see a close-up of their back end, their genitals, and that's really probably only relevant during the breeding season, you can't, unfortunately. Sometimes if they pee on camera, you can tell out whether it's a girl or a boy as well. A question from Chasey, do they eat hedgehogs? No, they will scavenge leftover hedgehogs, but one of the major predators of hedgehogs tends to be badgers. That's actually really quite challenging. They're just not worth the hassle. I've seen foxes bite hedgehogs, but no, they're not active predators or take any scavenged remains that they can get to, or maybe even a diseased or dying hedgehog, but it's not something they actively predate upon. Question from Sarah Allen, what about foxes and parasites? That's a big question, a big answer. I'm not even sure where to address that. Foxes do carry parasites. They carry a range of ones that can transmit to humans, although the greatest risk to humans comes from our own pets. In Europe, they have some really nasty parasites, and actually one of the ones that we have to worm our pets as part of Pet Passport is a parasite that is carried around by foxes. They're not the only source, and I say the main source of transmission is your domestic animals, but there are some nasty parasites. In the UK, really good hygiene and regular worming is the best way of reducing any transmission. Does that answer your question? But if not, please put in the chat. Edward Young, how well are foxes deterred by electric fences? Very well. Electric fences is one of the primary ways of actually deterring them from entering an area you don't want them to. Where correctly placed, so putting it too high with lots of space underneath, they'll go through it. But yes, electric fences are actually one of the better ways of deterrence. Going to the questions.
I've got a question actually, Carl, if you can hear me. You can't see
it
at the moment, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, David's asked, he's mentioned multipaternity in litters implies delayed implantation, for example, in badgers. Is this the case in foxes, or is it due to frequent mating in a short period?
It's due for frequent mating in a short period. They don't have delayed implantation as badgers do.
Okay, thank you. I have a question actually as well. Just you talked about climate and weather and how that affects foxes, or fox cubs really, I suppose. Have you observed any sort of significant changes in range or population density due to climate change in the UK?
Not in the UK. Foxes are found everywhere in the UK. They're so adaptable, but at the northern limits in particular, they are expanding into tundra regions. And particularly the kind of limit there tends to be the coldest part of the winter. And that's a real conservation problem because their range is starting to come into overlap with another species of fox called the Arctic fox. And they will compete for breeding sites, and red foxes will kill Arctic foxes. So that is a conservation problem, but that's right at the northern edge of their range. In the southern end of the range, it's not such a problem. But no, in Britain, they're found absolutely everywhere.
No, it's interesting. Thank you for that. We had one or two questions at the beginning about cats and foxes, which I think you've answered. Thank you. And also, Linda's asked, is the Arctic fox a subspecies?
No, it's a completely different species. It's actually the closest species to red foxes. They separated out a few million years ago, but no, it's a separate species. They're adapted to much colder climates. They're smaller in size, they've got smaller ears, and they also change colour. They have a blue form in summer, and then they change that lovely, beautiful white pelage in the wintertime. But that smaller size means that the red fox, which is the largest true fox, can unfortunately not only outcompete but can kill them. The other thing that's quite important is the availability of food during winter, so not just temperature, and by food, things like scavenged carcasses. So some of that spread north has been possibly driven by an increase in moose populations and potentially scavenged leftover remains of those from hunters.
Thank you. We have got quite a few questions coming through, actually. Has there been any evidence of rabies in foxes in the UK recently? Or ever? No.
No. During the 80s, and I remember this, I actually teach my students about it because I still remember the fear of rabies. During the late 80s, there was an extensive baiting program in Europe. They largest scale dropping of baits with a vaccine in it. And that actually pushed the front of rabies back to where it is now, which is about the edge of Poland. So all of Western Europe is now rabies free. We're still precautionary, that's why we still vaccinate against it, but your chances of actually having a dog that would be bitten or infected from it are very slim in most of Western Europe, so no.
Thank you. And I think I have a really nice question here, actually, from Katrina, who asks, what ignited your passion for foxes?
Oh, that's a good question. So when I started out, I was always interested in working on carnivores in general. I did work as an undergraduate in a zoo. I went and worked on wolves in mountains of Italy. And I was just wanted to work on a carnivore species. And that's where it started from. It was an opportunity, and I loved working with them. They were so fun, interesting, so much personality. Every single individual was different. I had foxes. I mean, my favorite was this fox called Kester. I remember going out the very first night to track her, and she, 5 minutes after I started tracking her, she started tracking me. She came down the driveways where I was tracking her and stood on the road and watched me, basically asking, "What on earth are you doing? Why are you following me?" And then she would periodically, she would do that, and she would come out, wander around, have a look, then trot off again, and I'd spend the rest of the night following her. And she was always my favourite because of that confidence around humans. So no, I liked carnivores, but then working on them, that really drove that interest in them.
Thank you. I'm just having a quick look. Somebody's asked, how high can a fox jump?
Good question. I've seen them go over 2-metre fences, not straight up like straight up and over. That's with scrabbling. But I think that when it comes to trying to keep foxes out of an area, don't underestimate how good they are at getting over things and what a tiny area they can get through. I've seen them squeeze through fences that you wouldn't believe. I mean, that's why they're fluffy, so they look bigger, but they really can just like eels through stuff. It's amazing.
Thank you. I'm just having a quick look to see if we've got any.
I've got two questions in the chat. I'm quite happy to answer.
Okay, yeah.
So one was, what's the strongest sense when they rely on hunting and foraging? So hearing and olfaction, so sense of hearing and smell are the two major ones. They will use eyesight a little bit. They do some pretty funky stuff when it comes to foraging. So there was some work done in Poland, which showed that when they were searching, they actually orientated the magnetic axis, the magnetic lines, essentially. So it seems they even have some, we don't know how, some basic magnetoreception as well, which they might use possibly as part of their catalogue, but certainly smell and hearing are the major ones. The other question about, two questions about how long they live, but I'll talk about the one about population. So fox populations are volatile in the sense of the BTO's Garden Bird Survey says they're declining. Mountain Society, they're stable. If you went to the Games Conservancy Trust, they would say they're on the increase. So you can have 3 different opinions from 3 different locations. Personally, I think it really depends on the methods used and where it's done. The last big survey that was run on fox populations, my wife actually ran it, I should say, and we found that populations were stable everywhere, but increasingly in the east of England. And that was probably coincident to a decrease in the amount of gamekeeping that was being done at the time. There's been no systematic survey. So all those methods that are done use different kinds of proxies. But proper systematic sampling of the fox population hasn't been done for quite a while. 14 years was the last time when we did it. So I think actually there's probably a need for doing it again. It's a lot of work. So question about longevity. They don't live very long. The average life expectancy is less than 12 months. If they get to 1 year of age, they can live to about 3 on average. That first year is when the majority of their mortality takes place. Very few of them get to breeding age, which is one reason why they have quite high productivity with large numbers of cubs. Very few of them make it through to adulthood. They can live maximally to 10 years plus. That's very rare in the wild. Very good question about disrupting fox territories. So we know that any kind of disruption of territories can lead to a perturbation in the population. Individuals may expand their territories, new individuals come in. The answer is probably yes. Never really been tested. We know from hunting that individuals will move in rapidly. From the perspective of their spatial territories, undoubtedly it causes some kind of flux to it. But without really going in and testing it, I don't think you could really conclusively say what happens to the fox population, either at the local level or more widely with fox hunting.
Okay, I think that's most of the questions really. Thank you, Carl. I mean, it's been a really excellent talk, so I'm really very grateful that you've taken the time out of your evening to talk to.
Apologise for having to leave twice, but my children were being pests.
These things happen, don't they? So we're really grateful. It's been a great talk. I'm sorry you can't see me at the moment, but I am not in control of the screen. And so thank you very much. I would just like to mention that the next Wildlife Trust, Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust local groups talk will be in January. So if you go onto the website, Joel Ashton will be talking about gardening for wildlife. And just once again, thanks, Carl. It's been really, really interesting. And there's lots of messages of thanks and appreciation in the chat and the Q&A. So it's very clear that everybody's enjoyed it enormously tonight. And we all could have sat here for another half an hour and listened to you, I think. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Joe now to finish off the session.
Yeah, on behalf of the Trust, Carl, we really appreciate your time. It's really clear how passionate you are about foxes and how much you love them, and hopefully that's been instilled in some of the viewers tonight as well. So to look out and watch out for the look out for foxes out and about, so that's really great. Tonight has been hosted, as I mentioned, by the Rutland local group, so we really appreciate that, and it's been put on for free by the Wildlife Trust, so if you are able to, please do make a donation on our website. And lastly, it's the last talk before Christmas, so we want to wish everybody a very happy Christmas, and we'll see you next year. So thanks again. Bye everyone.